Good afternoon. Glad to see you could make it. It's another beautiful day here in Minnesota. The sky is blue as the water and the smell of the fresh cut hay is in the air. I've been sitting here a while waiting for you to come along. Let's see. How do I describe what goes on around here at the Almelund Show?
Tradition. Heritage. Community. These are more than just words to us. It's our way of life and what the Almelund Show is to many good folks. We are a community coming together to relive and celebrate the history and heritage of Chisago County, Minnesota. It's where we're reminded how families tamed this once new land. The Almelund Show is a glimpse of our past and reminds us of a place that many of us still call home. It's the second weekend in August when things come to life around here. Old-timers like me are reminded of their youth. Some remember the hard and dangerous work, while still others recall the days and the sweet smells of Granddad's farm.
The show is a farming thing. It's a community thing. The draw of the show is just having a good time with your family. And not everybody here is a farmer. I'm not a farmer. I grew up in the city. I just like old stuff. Old engines, old tractors. And it gives me a place to display what I've collected. It gives me a chance to talk to other people like-minded. It's a good time, and that's what I think that's what draws the people to the show. It's just they're all talking on the same page.
Women folk will fondly remember Grandma's best Sunday dishes, or watch artisans of all kinds demonstrating their crafts, and master gardeners sharing secrets of nurturing flora. And if that's not enough, you're bound to find a hidden treasure or two at one of the largest flea markets around. The first Almelund Show was in 1954. In its early years, the show was held on a Sunday afternoon at various local farms. There were no porta potties in those days. Folks just used a nearby cornfield. Now, in a permanent location, the show has modern facilities, lasts 3 days, and gets bigger every year.
Another thing I think that makes it unique, we're sort of like a historical society. We operate on some of the same bases, but we also cater to families. But I think there's a lot of families that come to the show, bring their kids. In fact, we try to encourage that. If you looked at the grounds, that there's swing sets and sandboxes. And we try to have driver training during the show so that younger kids can drive their tractors in the parade and things like that.
A long time ago, I reckon over 150 years ago now, this part of the country belonged to the Ojibwe and Dakota tribes. They were none too friendly to each other, but with the exception of the Dakota War of 1862, they pretty much left the white man alone. We settlers continued to push west to find our destiny, and it was about this time that the first white men arrived in the North Country. I recollect it was in 1837 when the government reached an agreement with the Ojibwe to purchase the land north of the Mississippi and west of the St. Croix. Our country needed lumber in order to build a nation. This area was covered in giant white pine trees. It wasn't long before the lumber barons and 30,000 lumberjacks were clearing the Minnesota territory of timber. And boy, could those lumberjacks eat.
Hungry loggers would come into the dining room, sit down at their place at the table, and empty an entire platter of steak onto their plate. A working logger could usually handle around 9,000 calories a day of hearty foods, including ample servings of pie, cake, cookies, homemade breads, and other delicacies. Did you get enough pie? Anna M. Lind, Journal of Forest History.
Not too far down the road, the steam engine became the power for cutting up logs. We didn't need to depend on water power any longer. That put sawmills all over the countryside. Here at Almelund, we have a fully working sawmill, complete with a 1910 Russell steam engine to boot.
There's just something about a steam engine that is really cool, the way they work, and when you watch them run, you can't hardly hear them because there is no noise with steam. There's just something really unique with steam that kind of bites you and makes you really like it.
Our sawmill has been around almost as long as I have. Now that's saying something. It was resurrected by Gene Miller back in the 70s.
It's an old enterprise sawmill built somewhere around 1920s, 30s. It was a wood frame all rotted out when I purchased it. I rebuilt it all out of steel and moved it down here about 26 years ago. I guess the blade on it, that's a 56-inch Simon's 40-tooth blade. Otherwise, it's just a darn nice, heavy mill.
We use the lumber for putting up new buildings and for repairing the old ones at the show. Come see for yourself.
We actually saw the logs. We roll them into the machine up on this moving carriage. We have to carefully place them for the first cut, so we end up rolling them around and finding just the right spot to make that first cut. And the procedure is basically we square up the log. So once we get the log squared, we usually have a plan as to what type of wood we're cutting, like 6x6s, or we'll do 2x4s or 8s or 10s or whatever for building structures of buildings. And then a lot of what we saw is 1-inch thick boards we use here on the grounds for siding.
When this part of the country became the great state of Minnesota in '58, over half the land was covered with trees. We thought we'd never run out. But by the 1920s, Most of the trees were gone, and so was the logging and milling in Minnesota. Some folks said the land was so bare, it looked like the face of the moon. Now, while the loggers were cutting down the trees, settlers were making their way up the St. Croix River to the land of milk and honey. By the middle of the 1800s, Swedes came pouring into Lakes Country west of Taylor's Falls faster than they could eat their lutefisk. It wasn't the best farmland, but for the nearly penniless Swedes, it was cheap, it looked like Sweden, and it seemed like heaven to them. The letters they sent home brought thousands of Swedes from the homeland. Before long, Chisago County had the highest concentration of rural Swedes outside of Sweden.
There the wild animals wandered and fed, as though they were in a pasture that stretched much farther than a man could see, and there were no settlers. Only Indians lived there. Little house on the prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder.
The isolation of the wilderness weighed heavy on a woman's heart. Most likely she would never see loved ones left behind in the old country again, made living in the new land even more desperate.
Min käraste syster Edith, my dearest sister Edith, I hope this letter finds you well and in good spirits. It must be grand living in a new land with all of the opportunities you must have. Minnesota sounds like such a wonderful place to live. I can only imagine the size of those pine trees.
While Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, and other suffragettes were fighting for women's rights, the forgotten women of the wilderness had their own obstacles to overcome. But women folk had the worst of it. Most often, they would shoulder as much of the farm work as the men. The women were also expected to raise the children, tend to the meals, and many other chores demanded of a woman. Harvest time compounded her tasks.
I got up before 4, got breakfast, skimmed milk, churned, worked over the churning already on hand, did a large washing, baked 6 loaves of bread and 7 pumpkin pies. And while I was baking, did the ironing. Besides the everyday work of washing all the dishes, making the beds, and sweeping, I fed the threshing crew dinner. Sarah Brooks Sunberg, The Letters of Mary E. Carpenter.
The frontier women would nurse the sick and watch the children die of diseases without a cure. Many women would die at childbirth or infections caused by childbirth. If her man went off lumberjacking to raise a little money, she would face the cold winters alone. I remember Mama tending to the livestock, chopping wood, and doing many of the other necessities to survive the harsh winters.
Carl Oscar measured the sloping meadow with his eyes. Here lay his fields. There grew the timber for his house. In front of him lay the water with game birds and fish. Here he had fields and forests and a lake in one place. Here things grew and throve and lived and moved in whatever direction he looked. On the ground, in trees and bushes, on land and water. At last he had found the right spot. This was the place for a farmer's home. Here he must live, and he would be the first one to raise his house on the shores of Lake Kitchisaga, onto a good land. Wilhelm Moberg.
The best land and clear meadows were taken by the first settlers to the area. The rest of us to come along had to clear stumps and rocks in order to plant a crop. It could take many seasons to clear a few acres of land without friends or family to help. But the land, Land that was better than any of us from the old country had ever seen. With sweat and toil and many hardships, our land was eventually cleared and crops began to flourish. The Industrial Revolution eventually spilled onto the Minnesota farm with newfangled mechanized methods. These new methods and learning how to improve the land gave us a better crop production. In 1890, there were 117,000 Minnesota farms that harvested 3.4 million bushels of wheat. However, nothing has ever been easy for the farmer. The process of threshing began with a horse-drawn and later tractor-drawn binder that would cut the grain stalks and gather them into bundles. To keep them from rotting, the bundles had to be stacked into shocks in order to dry. When it was time, the wagons were loaded and the bundles were hauled to the thresher. A crew of men would pitch the bundles into the hopper and the huge machine would separate the kernels from the straw. The straw would come out of the other end of the thresher, and the kernels would pour out of the spout in the side of the big machine and be collected into bags. Bert Nelson, born in July of 1882, recalls,
"The summer I was 14, I became one of the threshing crew, and was I ever proud. Pa was more interested in the weather and the price and the yield of grain, but the crew was mostly interested in what the women folk prepared to eat. When the dinner bell sounded, everyone scrambled for the house. First stop was a long wooden bench near the kitchen door where there were several tin wash basins for removing dust and chaff. The crew would slop water in their dirty faces and come up snorting and blowing. The younger fellers had a community comb placed near the bench for any sprucing up they cared to do. Many times, the neighbor women would come help prepare the big meal. The neighbor girls were good at helping in the kitchen too, especially when they had their eyes on some good-looking member of the crew.
In one way or another, the Almelund Fire Department has been involved in the threshing show since its inception in 1954. For the last several decades, the department has been responsible for the food concessions at the show and is darn proud of the quality and delivery of their products to the customer.
We serve around 15 to 20,000 people that come through the show. Ton of burgers, maybe 1,500 pounds of hot dogs, maybe 2,000 pounds of French fries. It's amazing the record amount of food that we go through, and every year it's increasing. We have about 15 to 30 firefighters, and I would say throughout the whole show, over 100 and some people volunteer, help out, and come to do this show. It's a tremendous amount of help, support from the community.
About the time my granddad was settling in on his property up the river a ways, the new Chisago County Courthouse was being built for a cost of $5,023.70. The wooden frame courthouse was finished in 1876. It stood proud and tall until it was moved in 1990. After a few stops along the way, the oldest standing wooden courthouse in Minnesota was eventually purchased for $1 and sited on the grounds of the Almelund Threshing Show.
The courthouse sat here for approximately 15 years with nothing being done. During the resurrection of this building and the reconstruction of this building, it was important to preserve the tin ceilings. We sandblasted the ceilings with a diamond dust, and we've been getting diamond dust out of the cracks ever since.
Now, the courthouse is used for displays, live demonstrations, music, and entertainment during the show. The displays change a bit every year, so you never know what you're going to see. You can also get your picture dressed up in the clothes of yesteryear. It's a great way to remember your time at the show.
It is important to keep the history of the courthouse alive. This building is a wonderful example of how our country has grown and how it has served this country and the judicial system and the recording system for 150 years. And it's a beautiful building.
You know it's time for the Almelund Threshing Show when you see tractors driving down the side of the road heading for the ATS grounds. The caravan gives the collectors an opportunity to drive their prized tractors and show off what they got. The antique tractors usually hold a special meaning for the collectors. These are the tractors that were on Granddad's farm or the tractors that they drove as a boy on their own family farms. Many times these are the actual family tractors that were used, and in one way or the other have been passed down, restored, and proudly displayed by the collector.
At 1 o'clock, you need to register your tractor up by the information building. There's a little building right next to it.
I've been bringing tractors down here regularly since 2004, about 10, 11 years. John Deere is what I grew up operating on my grandfather's farm. I was 5 years old. I first learned how to drive a John Deere A, and it's just something that's been with me all of these years.
I'm a tractor collector, I guess. I started collecting the 3 tractors that we farmed with when I was a young man in outside of North Branch, Minnesota. I restored 2 out of those 3 tractors, and I still have them today. And it's really fun to take them to a show where you're exhibiting them, and somebody will come up and say, yeah, I had one just like this, or my grandpa had one just like this. And I said, yeah, I had this one.
I'm going to pull this in the tractor pull. The 2 wheels are on Sunday. I'm going to do the driving, yeah. Well, I bought this tractor up at Thief River Falls. A lot of stuff was stolen off it, but I found all the parts that fit a 25D. And I restored the whole tractor myself. They started the D in 1923, and it ran to 53. They ran over 30 years. It's a really nice tractor. It's light and it's got a lot of power to get over the mud holes. The neighbor at 27D, when I was a little boy, when I went to the one-room school at Hay Lake, they asked him how much power it had. He said if I had a chain long enough to go around the world, I could pull that over too. Yeah.
I'm not a gamble man, but this is something just too good to be true. The show raffles off a completely restored tractor every year. This year, a 2-tone Case 430B has been restored and is ready for a new owner. What's so unique about it? The show members turned it into an experience for kids.
I truly believe that these old ways of doing things, our history with our tractors, is very important to keep and to pass on. We need to know where we came from in order to know where we're going in the future. And I think this is important for our young people to understand. So we started talking back and forth, and somehow or another, the idea of the kids, young kids from 12 and older, to be involved, to introduce them to mechanic work, old tractors, and eventually the show. The kids are really excited. They go home afterwards, tell mom and dad and grandpa and grandma all about what they did here, and if they want to come back every year.
Nothing's better than an ice cold drink after a day of threshing oats or baling hay. And most of us need to wet our whistle a time or two when we're at the show. That makes our Lions Club beer garden a popular place for a lot of our visitors. And while you're sipping suds or sodas and resting your feet, we have the best of the area's performers to entertain you throughout the day. When the sun goes down, the day's still not over at the show. On Friday and Saturday nights, we have popular regional acts that will make you dance the night away.
And come to you when I die.
I bet you didn't know that flea markets are rooted in history too. This time, however, Minnesota can't take credit. The first time the term flea market was used was in Paris, France, when Napoleon demolished the slums to make way for a new grand downtown Paris. Today's American flea market is a modern version of a phenomenon that has endured throughout history and all civilized society.
I've been coming to this show here at Almelund for like about 3 or 4 years. Well, it's the people here are really fun. It's kind of family oriented. You know, a bunch of country boys and girls getting down on the farm, so to speak. I collect some stuff, but just kind of do it for the enjoyment. I enjoy the Americana history. So looking at these objects, you know, there's a story behind it, individual stories in the American story. I just kind of dig that.
For many farmers, farming was about competition with their neighbors. Whose crops got in first? How many bushels per acre you got? And who had the strongest team of horses? Then, as it is today, the strength of a team was determined by how much weight and how far you could pull a sled. The team that could pull the farthest with the most weight was the winner. The prize for winning was a year of bragging rights about your team to all your neighbors. Pull on Sunday, plow on Monday was the motto of the 50s and the 60s. But using the standard farm tractor wasn't good enough for some. They needed an edge and began to modify the tractors to have more power. It wasn't long, and the pull on Sunday, plow on Monday motto became obsolete. Today, they give you a trophy for winning. And like it's always been, a year of bragging rights to your neighbors.
Our tractor pull at Almelund is a 3-day event, and each day is a different tractor pull entirely. Friday night, there's less rules, and you can have your tractor hot rodded up quite a bit without getting into any trouble. The Saturday afternoon pull is left for more antique and more stock and slower moving tractors. Our Sunday afternoon tractor pull is limited to tractors that have not pulled on Friday or Saturday, and they are completely from the field.
Motorized pulls started in 1929. Although it was a recognized sport, tractor pulls didn't catch on until the 1960s.
I don't spend a lot of time with my brother, you know, on a day-to-day basis, and this is a weekend that we're together from Friday night to Sunday night, and my dad as well. So the three of us get to, you know, have fun, hanging out, doing what we like to do. My younger brother, he and I pull tractors together. We spend a lot of time at my mom and dad's, just taking them out of the shed and driving them up and down the road. I've gotten my daughter involved with that, and she absolutely loves it. So she knows that when she turns 12, she gets to drive the orange one, and that is something that she's really excited about. And so am I, because I don't want the threshing show experience to stop with me and my brother. I want it to continue because it's something that we all really, really enjoy.
School wasn't one of my favorite things growing up. Now, I'm not saying school was a bad thing, but it always got in the way of hunting in the fall and planting in the spring. I learned my reading, writing, and arithmetic like the other kids, but Miss Christensen never told me what grade I belonged in. So I just kept going to school till I didn't fit in the desk anymore. One of the things that we had to do at school was to speak, read, and write in English. It's something we wanted to do. We all wanted to become U.S. citizens, so during class time we did our work in English and struggled to be Americans.
A. B.
But during recess and lunch hour, we usually slipped back into Swede.
No, there was about 12.5 of us in the school. I was in 4th grade at the time. And of course, the different classes
sitting in school with other students from anywhere from 1st grade up to 8th grade. Sit there and listen to the teacher teaching the kids in the next grade up. And so they had a bit of an advantage. And so you got a good education in a country schoolhouse. It was a great experience.
As I look back on the one-room school, it meant a lot of things to a lot of people. The school building was the community center for local events. Political meetings, ladies' aid socials, and young people's meetings were among the social events held in the schoolhouse. The best affairs of the year were the annual Christmas program and the end-of-the-year picnic. We have the old Clover Blossom Schoolhouse built in 1887 on the showgrounds. It still has the original tin walls and ceiling, the original heating stove too. It brings back a lot of memories. Stop in when you're at the show and try to imagine what it was like when innocence and naivety filled the one-room schoolhouse with simpler times. It makes me think back of the first girl I was ever sweet on. She had good, strong hands to milk the cows, and her pa gave her the pick of the litter when the sow had her piglets.
Well, that about wraps it up. It's been a pleasure showing you what the Almelund Threshing Show is all about. Lots of things for lots of folks, and something new every year. Say, if you're ever up our way, feel free to stop on by and say hello. Our doors are open the second weekend in August, and the coffee is always on. See you now.